any progress. And I'm sure that is seeping back through. I think that is behind the comment in his 25th anniversary documentary at the weekend saying, well, I might have to use tactical nuclear weapons because my army just can't do it. And why I have written in the UK's Telegraph today saying we must be aware of this, and this is where the Americans and others must step up and ensure that Putin doesn't use a tactical nuclear weapon.
You just mentioned about the Russian threat of using nuclear weapons. According to the Telegraph, the United Kingdom is finally preparing for the war against Russia, preparing for a direct military attack by Russia by outlining and updating 20 years old contingency plans to put the country on war footing in case of direct attack. Also, a classified document will set out how the government would respond in case of attack by the Russian side. What is your assessment of this new military planning going on inside the British government?
Well, I think it's quite complex, and if I try and explain it as straightforwardly as possible, as you said, these plans haven't been reviewed for 25 years, and because of everything that's happening at the moment, people have rightly decided that we need to review them. At the end of the Cold War in the 90s, the peace dividend, as we call it, meant that militaries like Britain and other European countries really saved as much money as they can on the military. They saved as much money as they could by not having plans. In the Cold War, there were bunkers all over the UK where politicians and others would hide in if they were being attacked. There were stores of food in case the UK got cut off. And everybody in the country knew what to do if there was a nuclear strike. But for 25 years, we've just forgotten about it. But the UK seems to be very much the focus of a lot of threats coming from Putin. And he is frequently threatened, or his aides like Medvedev have threatened that they'll fire a nuclear missile at London. Now, I don't think anybody really until recently believed that they might do that. And I think it's part of that is what the review is all about. Also, the new government has a strategic defence review that is about to be announced very soon, recognising that Britain needs a stronger military to be able to create a deterrence against Putin. And also, it's the UK and France who are leading what's called the Coalition of the Willing, to provide a military force that would ensure that a ceasefire holds in Ukraine, hopefully when we've got it. But all of that put together means that the threats coming out of Moscow and threats coming from Putin, especially on the nuclear side, are now being taken very, very carefully and very seriously in London, because the final bit of this, we've talked about nuclear a few times, but Britain doesn't have tactical nuclear weapons. So if Putin fired a tactical nuclear weapon, the only thing open to Britain would be to fire a strategic nuclear weapon, which would then potentially create a much wider nuclear conflict. So there is an imbalance at the moment. And I think the British and other European countries are trying to make sure that they can redress that, because when Putin looked west back on the 24th of February 2022, he didn't see a conventional deterrence in Europe that would stop him invading Ukraine. And when he looks west now, there is a nuclear imbalance, and that equilibrium needs to be sorted out as soon as possible. So I think it is a demonstration by the British government to Putin that we're serious about this. And Britain is not going to back down and is going to support Ukraine as long as it takes to get a just ceasefire for Ukraine.
Thank you, Colonel Hamish, for your time and for your support for Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
Thank you very much for having me. Glory to Ukraine.
Well, again, Daniel, my belief is, looking at history, is that the Russian forces today will not be able to cross the Dnieper River anytime soon. And therefore, they will need a period of rest. They will need to rebuild. They will need to replace their main battle tanks, their artillery shells. They will need to repair the wounded. They will need to create new supply lines. And they will need that. That will probably take a few years. But the worry here is that Russia has done it once. They have had an extremely difficult time. They probably expected to subjugate the whole of Ukraine within days back in February of 2022. But they will have learnt their lesson. They would come back stronger. The whole Russian defense industrial base is now on a war footing. And therefore, within a matter of a few years, Russia will be ready for this next big push. They would know how to get across the Dnieper River. And unless Ukraine was very well prepared, that would probably signify the start of the next phase of battle. So for me, what's key here is that Russia will eventually grind to a halt. For now, the challenge, of course, then is how on earth does Ukraine secure the security guarantees it needs to make sure that Russia cannot do that next push forward. And that won't be something that Ukraine can do alone. I suspect that is something that ideally NATO would have provided, but it looks unlikely that NATO will be the answer. So what are the elements of that security that needs to be in place, not just a signature on a bit of paper, but actual credible deterrence that will stop Russia from coming again in a few years' time?
Let's also cover recent developments in the assassination campaign inside Russia. Recently, Russian General Yaroslav Moskalik has been killed in car bomb attack near Moscow. And last year, in December last year, another Russian general, Igor Kirillov, was killed in the bomb attack. How do you see the main consequences of this attack on Vladimir Putin's chain of command and his army, and how do you see the psychological consequences of this?
Yes, I mean, when that assassination came through, it was big news, but it's not the first time that Russian generals have been attacked. Whilst it captured the news headlines, if you look at it from a strategic perspective, Russia has got lots of generals. This will not affect the war at all. I think what it does do is it's part of Ukraine's strategy to demonstrate that they can take the war to Russia. Russia isn't in complete control. What Russia is trying to do is to keep the war in Ukraine's boundaries so that Muscovites and those people in Russia can get on with their day-to-day lives and just listen to the news and hear tales of fancy of what's going on. By targeting Russian generals on the ground, by closing down the Russian airports, by targeting Russian oil supplies, refineries, and key airfields, what Ukraine is very effectively doing is demonstrating to the Russian population that President Putin is not in control, that he is fighting a war, and that Ukraine is capable of fighting back. But I wouldn't want to read too much into the loss of one Russian general. It is of concern for Russian forces, but quite bluntly, in an autocratic regime, as in Russia, President Putin has a lot of disposable generals. He will not miss a beat just because he loses one or two to assassinations.
Let's cover also, you just mentioned about Vladimir Putin. It's 25 years of Vladimir Putin's rule, and Russian propaganda channels have produced this big documentary about Vladimir Putin. He was showing journalists his flat in Kremlin. It's interesting that there weren't any kind of windows in his flat. Did you see this film, and what is your impression of this demonstration of Putin's main achievements?
I deliberately didn't watch that, Daniel, because I am not the target audience for that film. The target audience was the domestic Russian audience. And I think what's telling is under normal times, Putin